session is on gaming and gambling convergence. And we have some interesting expertise in-house, and we've also have another student who's coming from out the TRG family here to speak about skill in slot machine games. And so joining us this week is Chanel Larche. Chanel is at the University of Waterloo, where she is a PhD student. And she has done a lot of really interesting work in several forms of, we'll talk about it in a minute, but I don't want to spoil it. But it's a little bit different than the work that Sally's actually going to be talking about that her and I have collaborated on, which is games that have integrated gaming components onto actual slot machine devices that are in casinos or other commercial gaming locations. Now, because Sally is gone, we actually pre-recorded a part of this session. So what we're going to do first is we're going to play the session that we pre-recorded, including Sally. And for those speakers who have been on the TRG seminar before and have been from the UK or other parts of Europe, and Sally forced you to get up or stay up until well past midnight your time, now's the time to send her a very terse email saying that you should have pre-recorded your sessions too. But without further delay, allow me to share the session that was pre-recorded, and then we're going to come back and a conversation about the outcomes, as well as you'll see us appearing in the chat today.
Hi everyone, welcome to the latest installment of the Technology, Risk and Gambling Seminar Series. Today we're going to be looking at a topic that has a lot of interest for researchers and regulators around the world. It's the topic of skill-based gambling machines or gaming machines or video-based gaming machines. There is really no accepted terminology yet. I'm going to launch straight into a bit of a background and overview. And I'm going to start with actually a description of what these machines refer to. I'm going to play this while I talk over that. These are machines that are chance-based.
This is our bet menu where I can choose my bet amount. As I choose the bet amount, it updates on the screen, so it tells me what my payouts are. Then we have a fixed pay table. So I take out 6 or more lots, I win the money. 10, I get the bet. So I'm going to play a game for $10. Hit play. The way the gameplay works is I have 45 seconds to take out as many robots as possible. So I'm going to move that, and I'm trying to take out as many danger bots as possible. And I'm just about to luck out because I just got a power up. What that power up does is it gives me a shield that protects me from the robots, but it also gave me an instant $100 cash prize as well. Every time you kill a robot, it shows up on the score. Exactly. So as I engage and take out the robots, it updates on the score here. Once I get to 5, 6 robots, I'm in the money. 10 robots for the highest payout. Three different goals and challenges. Kill 30 music shooter. Kill 30 zombies and block 3 fences. So if I get 1 mission, I get 20 bucks, 2 missions, 50 bucks, 3 missions, $100. So I'm going to jump into the game. And the controls are pretty easy. We're trying to keep gameplay pretty simple so that whether you're a fan of the original game or you've never seen this before, it's pretty easy to jump in and play. So basically, my controller is on the right, and then I have control of the firing. You can see it at little bird. He's going to be taking out guys on me.
Okay, so one thing to note about these machines is they look very different. So when you hear people talking about skill-based gambling machines, don't get a certain image in your mind. There's a large variety in terms of what they can look like. Physically, some of them have gaming controllers or joysticks. Some of them have even things like guns or guitars to play on. They all have underlying same minimum return to play percentage, so they all fit the criteria to an extent of an electronic gaming machines in that they're predominantly chance-based, but they have skill interwoven in them in a different way. Some machines have the skill in a very discrete entity of the game. They might even have real spins and then a skill component. Some have skill integrated throughout. But as you can see from some of these examples, for example, in the first one, you randomly are given some power-ups, so you have access to bonus features. In the Frogger, when you're moving through, the ease of which that maze occurs is randomly determined. So there is always a random nature in the game, and the skill is always capped. So you can see, for example, on the screen here, even the most skilled player is only within $1,000. The main jackpots, the overriding prizes are always still chance determined. So it means that every player still has a chance of winning the jackpot and still having a win, even if they have no skill whatsoever. So Kahlil and I have been looking at these games now for a couple of years, and we've done a number of studies. The first study, we looked at this game, Nothing But Net, as well as several other games, and we looked at understanding how consumers understood how they worked, because obviously from a policy point of view, it's really important to understand whether players can make an informed decision about these games. Do they even understand how they work? We found that consumers generally do understand that there is a skill component to these games, and we compared them to a standard electronic or slot machine to make sure that there was a comparison there, but they didn't have a good understanding of exactly how the outcomes are determined. That really they knew there was some skill involved, but it wasn't a clear understanding exactly of the mechanisms. We also found when we did this subsequent study, and I'll get into all of this in more detail, using this particular machine, Fortunes of the Brave, made by YMAC, which does have a real spin component and then a standalone feature, which is skill-based. We wanted to look at how people were playing it. So in looking at all of these studies across them, we found that there are some characteristics of people who are likely to find the games appealing that does correlate with people who have vulnerability to gambling harms. Now, this is a correlational study, so we're looking at people who are likely to find the games appealing or who are already playing the games in markets where they're available, so things like places like Nevada and California. We found that the people who are more likely to gravitate to the machines did have higher cognitive distortions in relation to gambling. They were more likely to experience illusions of control. They were also more likely to have gambling problems, and the machines did appeal to a younger cohort who were more interested and had experience with gaming, which is what to be expected. These are obviously machines trying to appeal to a broader demographic than traditional slot machines. And that the appeal of the machines was impacted by everyone's personal attitudes. They're also social norms, so how likely other people were likely to play, as well as their comfort with games and gaming devices. And you can see from the picture here, this one actually has a gaming controller. So when we had studies where we had regular slot machine players come and use them, a lot of people were very unfamiliar with that style of play and found that quite uncomfortable using a game controller. So there are some aspects of the games, even though they're made to be relatively easy to play for a broad demographic, that it is initially more appealing to a certain group. What we haven't seen and what we need to do is look at these machines over the long term. So these are really novice players seeing them for the first time, essentially, or in new markets where they're introduced. We know that there's an adaptation whenever a new type of gambling is introduced, that people with gambling problems and involved gamblers are most likely to see them and gravitate to them. We need to look at the longer term of what the potential impact is. But I'm going to hand over to Chanel to talk about her research in terms of skill and gaming, and then we'll go from there in terms of what happens when you combine these two. So I'll pass over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Sally. So I'll just try to start my slide here. All right, so I was really enthused to see a lot of questions related to this topic kind of come through in previous webinar episodes in this series. And so hopefully I'll be able to address some of those with my PhD research. So in traditional slots, there is no skill. All outcomes are determined by a random number generator. So despite this, players interact with structural features that bring forth the illusion of skill during play. They come to believe that they can control the game. And problematically, we know that the mere belief of having skill in slots increases players' gambling behavior and subsequently the development of problem gambling. So one such feature is called the stop button. So as the reels are spinning, if you push a stop button, all it does is get you to the randomly selected outcome faster. But another extensively studied misleading feature is the Nearmiss. So in slots, Nearmisses are conceptualized as outcomes that appear to just miss the big prize. And a traditional Nearmiss is best explained using a 3-reel slot machine, with the jackpot prize being tied to aligning 3 red 7s on a K line. So you spin the reels, and the first red 7 falls on the K line, followed by the second matching red 7. And then on the third reel, something evil happens, by which the third red 7 appears on the third reel, but falls just above and below the K line. So clearly, this is an unpleasant and undesirable outcome. That is objectively a loss. The player loses their wager on that spin. Yet despite being frustrating, this outcome has been found to be very motivating. Players play longer in games with near misses than in games without near misses. And in a study we conducted, those with gambling problems were more likely to endorse that near misses reflected their skill at slots and were a kind of harbinger of an upcoming win. What's even more disturbing is that game designers use something called a virtual rate mapping to cause players to encounter near misses more often than they would in a fair game. Okay, so mobile games with an actual skill component also take advantage of the invigorating effect of near misses. Unlike slots, near misses in games are actually meaningful. So they signify that a player's skill is almost high enough to beat the level. And since skill improves with practice, the more you play, the more likely you are to level up. So near misses should increase the urge to continue playing. So being dubbed the Queen of Candy Crush by my incredible supervisor, it's only fitting that we examine near misses and how they impact players in that particular game. So near misses are portrayed by this unambiguous feedback that a player is close to reaching their goal. In this case, you only need 2 more ingredients to win. So they differ from loss-related messages, since losses only have this broad out-of-the-moon message. And we showed that like near misses in slots, near misses in Candy Crush trigger greater arousal, frustration, and urge to continue play compared to regular losses. So another key point that we'll just cover today is that having skill in games also plays a role in how players experience flow. So this feeling of deep, effortless concentration, where you lose track of all else except the game. And in the flow state, you lose track of time and become completely immersed in the game. If you lose track of time, this can have obvious negative consequences. So for slot gamblers to experience flow, they often play for longer than intended and lose more money than intended. And just like in the slots literature, flow is related to negative consequences in video game play, with harm centered around spending too much time being immersed in gameplay. And in the flow literature, there are certain factors that are known to promote flow. One of them is the skill challenge balance. And it's classically understood by means of this model developed by Csikszentmihalyi. So in this model, challenges on the x-axis ranges from low to high, and skills on the y-axis ranges from low to high. Simply put, this model portrays that flow is optimized by this perfect matching between the challenges of the game and the skills of the player. So using myself as an example, I'm not very good at video games. So I'll probably fall on the lower end of this channel. But as long as I feel the challenges match my skill, I will feel optimal flow or balance. So if the game is too easy for a highly skilled gamer like Homer, for example, they'll fall into the boredom quadrant. And conversely, if the game is too challenging, like Lisa, they'll feel anxious and fall into this anxiety quadrant. And falling outside that wiggly line flow channel is antithetical to flow. And the key implication of this model is that it doesn't matter how skilled you are, as long as you're adequately challenged, you will enter flow. And a more refined model exists as well. And it posits that flow is only achieved for highly skilled players, and the challenges of the games are also high. And just for reference, this is one of the top 3 Super Smash Brothers video game players, esports player. This quadrant model carries implications for advanced, highly skilled players. So under this model, players are more likely to experience flow as they become more skilled and reach a point in the game where it becomes excessively challenging. So although a lot of researchers have speculated that greater flow among skilled players in games like poker increase flow, to my knowledge, no one has actually demonstrated this. So we adjudicated between the two models by having people play games around their level standing in Candy Crush. And then we measured how skillful they felt and how challenging they thought the game was, and measured how much flow they experienced. So in this graph, the red line is the theoretical exact balance of challenge and skill. And I've also graphed where the actual players fall based on their rating. You can see that some of the players right away fall onto this red line. They have an exact match between their skill and challenge. And if the process model is correct, then it's these guys that should experience high flow. And research suggests that those with the high skill experience greater flow. And since flow is a very pleasurable state, it's a very reinforcing place to be. So given that flow is associated with losing track of time and problematic play, are finding that the most skilled players experience the greatest flow suggests that these players have the highest potential for developing problems, especially if they possess other risk factors, like if they game for escape. So that's all I have to go through in my data.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chanel. That's really interesting. So I've got lots of questions for you, and I might start with the last point that we ended on. And we had spent some merch on earlier in the series talking about flow, and we had a conversation about that. And I think that's really interesting because when you're designing a video game, flow is a highly desirable outcome, and this idea of entertainment is the fundamental model of the gambling industry, and that's something that as researchers and people who focus on gambling harms, we often struggle with. This is actually an activity that people are very engaged with and they enjoy. And so when you're designing a skill-based gambling machine, then the optimal state should be to get people to be enjoying it. It's supposed to be an entertainment activity. And so you're trying to create something that's the right level of intensity, of interest and challenging and engaging. But at the same time, there is this conflict because people have to actually spend money per button push on this, as opposed to buying a video game and just playing it for hours, or even a monthly subscription model. Like it's the user pays per game or per real action within the game. So where is this sort of line in your research? And I don't know if you looked at this about what participants' view was, because in our research, when we looked at this level of immersion, we asked people before and after how immersed they feel, and we did focus groups, we did cognitive interviewing with people to try and see, is it sort of overly immersive to the point that people are losing track and experiencing disassociation? And we found in our lab-based studies that there was no greater immersion in a skill-based game than in a slot machine. However, in our cognitive interviews and in our focus groups, the participants did report they were more immersed in a skill-based component. They weren't focusing on how much they were spending, although in this particular game, they weren't actually spending money, but that was actually pleasurable for them. So that for them specifically made it better value for money because the engagement and the entertainment was there. So from your research in terms of looking at what is the benefit? Is flow state an optimal outcome for when you're gambling, or is that potentially an evil outcome where we're encouraging people to engage to the extent that they are kind of fixated or continuing play without concentration?
That's a really great question. And I think mostly in our, both in our slot machine and video game research, the key to differentiating whether it's a positive state to seek and play versus a very negative one is whether they or not they play for escape. So even in our video game research, we find that those who actually score higher on escapism end up experiencing more profound flow and also more profound positive affect during play. And this is associated, but outside of the game, they are not experiencing that the same level of positive affect. They usually have high ratings of depression or even boredom proneness, which is also a very aversive state to be in. So,
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's like the individual's characteristics of whether they can then control themselves of that state or whether it's they're going to kind of lean in. Because then I want to get to your earlier point about persistence. And when you're gambling on these machines, persistence has a price, a very fixed and somewhat expensive price to some extent, that the more you play to improve your skill, the more it costs you. However, there might be a sort of return on investment, theoretically at least, whereas the more skilled player has a greater chance of accessing some of the prizes. Now, obviously there's random determination. In the short, like over the long term, everyone's going to lose money, but a skilled player will essentially do better to an extent, to a capped extent. So how is it, it seems like the more skilled player is almost worse off, because if you're not skilled at all, you kind of know that you've got no chance. So you might be having fun, but you're not really going to get anywhere. It's that someone who's having those near misses, which might be random or it might be skill related that they're having that near miss. What impact do you think the combination of skill has on the impact that we know has been studied by yourself in your lab with Mike Dixon on near misses, when it might be within your control to then change that outcome?
So I just wanted to ask a clarification. So are you asking about whether like the influence of the near misses on flow, or like what do you mean by being able to change that outcome? Sorry. Yeah,
so in a slot machine, if you have a near miss, like it's totally random. Whereas in a skill-based game machine, if you almost win, it might be because you just aren't quite good enough yet. But if you keep practicing, you actually will be able to change. You will be more likely to experience a win. So we know we've been studying, or you guys, we researchers, you guys have been studying near misses, and it has these outcomes on arousal and cognitions and physiological reactions. Do you think that's the same, or do you think we need to restudy that in a skill-based component?
Yeah, I think they are relatively the same, but I think one thing that we could potentially like measure if we were to have, let's say, video game players play a slot machine is like how much skill they actually think that they have. And yeah, we haven't actually compared the two types of outcomes directly in a study. So I think that would be a really a good follow-up to what we've already been doing. Usually like our measures of our studies of near misses have been just in slots in isolation and in candy crush in isolation.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of the work that's been done on the slot machines that almost needs to be re-examined now. We've spoken, if you're playing bingo at home, about our replication studies, about the need to replicate things when the situation evolves. And certainly a lot of the research that's fundamental and underpinning the gambling research and theory was done on slot machine players in the 1990s, which arguably they were a different cohort and there was completely different machines, even to the current slot machines, even though maybe the mechanics are similar, that these new products are forcing us to re-examine some of those fundamental understandings that we have. So I guess what would, in terms of your thoughts of the next stage, and I was really interested in this combination of kind of easy versus the challenge is anxiety versus pleasurable state. It differs between players. So some of the skill-based gambling machines actually allow for differentiating levels of skill, and they detect that when the player starts playing. and they then change the level of difficulty so that kind of it keeps piquing that interest rather than be too challenging or too hard. Have you looked at games at all and things like Candy Crush? Does the level of difficulty change within those games, or is it, everyone who plays gets the exact same game?
That's really interesting. Yeah, so it does depend on where you are in the game. So the way that the game is structured is that when you start off, you as a low skill player, they keep the challenge kind of titrated to your skill level as you progress throughout the game. So, and I think for the most part, like it is on a level by level basis. So technically, yes, people do get the same level, like challenge levels or puzzles that they have to solve for each game. So it does. So there is like in the design itself, there is a ramping structure of difficulty, and it is on a level by level basis. Do you find most like the skill-based gaming machines that are on the casino floors right now, do you find that they follow a similar structure where like do they titrate the challenges in the game to the player's abilities, or is it just like you were saying, like a one-size-fits-all kind of challenge structure?
I think it's mostly one size fits all. However, there are differences, and some jurisdictions, I think in New Jersey, I'm not a regulatory scholar, but I think in New Jersey, they do allow the skill level to fluctuate in response to the player. And some of the machines are multiplayer, which means that you're actually playing against someone else. And in those situations, the more similar to poker, which is a chance game, but it has interactions, the more skilled player has an edge over the less skilled player because they're playing head to head. So they do differ. And the interesting thing about these machines is they're so quickly evolving. Some of the manufacturers are on their 4th or 5th iteration of the same machine. So there's a lot of focus testing, a lot of tweaking going on.
That's really fascinating.
I'm going to jump in the conversation because I have a question that I think is relevant to both sides of this conversation, and it's about protective factors embedded within both these different game types, mobile games, but then also skill-based gaming machines. So Sally, I know maybe I'll ask this to you first, and then I'll ask Chanel. The skill-based games come in a big variety of combinations. So one of the varieties is multiplayer games, as you just described. And what I wonder is whether there's any reason to think that having a multiplayer game is going to be protective in any way, shape, or form, or whether there's other elements around skill-based games more generally that you would find protective. And then Chanel, I'm going to ask the same question to you. One of the things I've heard anecdotal evidence about is that people might migrate from traditional slot machines to mobile games if they are having problems with slots, and that helps fill a bit of that void, both in stimulation and time and all these other sorts of things. So perhaps you can just stew on that for a moment while I turn the conversation over to Sally to ask or to respond to that protective factor question.
Yeah, I think thanks, Kahlil. And a lot of the focus on these machines, rightly from a regulatory point of view, is what's the harm? Oh, this is new. What's going to go wrong? This looks very different. There's a lot of concern about that. Is it appealing to a vulnerable population? Young people, the youth, they're all very problematic. So there's a lot of reactions and concern. But I think we do need to look at what is new about these machines. Similar to when we did internet gambling, when I first looked at internet gambling, there's so much potential there for it actually to be less harmful than land-based gambling. So for these machines specifically, there are some natural built-in features, and obviously there's variation. The first one I would say is there's a lot more natural breaks in play. Because they're quite game set, you will have kind of a set game experience and then an outcome, and then it almost resets and you play again. There is obviously variation, but there typically is a break in play to allow something like a jackpot or some other action to take place. And that is really important because compared to a real-based machine, we've just been talking about flow and disassociation, you just press a button, and you can literally do that for hours and nothing will change to interrupt that state. These machines require more cognitive engagement because you're actively making decisions. You might be doing so in a state of flow, probably not. Most people are probably not very good at these machines, but even theoretically, you're making an active decision, you're responding to the game, you're thinking. It's very cognitively engaging, which is extremely different from slot machines where there's literally nothing you can do other than change what your size or your lines bets are. So I think from that point of view, the fact that there's a natural break in play throughout the game, different points in time, that you're actively engaged in the game, making decisions, that you're even doing some of the games have things like customization. You have like an avatar or a side kind of game where it's not even related to the betting. So you're actually spending time on tasks that have nothing to do with winning or losing or spending money. So in these games, in some of them, there's periods of time where you're not actually betting anything. You're just doing a different activity. So I think there's a lot of features that could be exploited to kind of bulk that up and make it more focused, and maybe accompany that with messages to encourage people to think about taking a break. You're maybe even having sort of pauses in gameplay. So the multiplayer games, for example, you actually can't play them without everyone there. So there's kind of this built-in break that if someone else gets up or if you want to sit down and play and no one's there, you can't play them. And I think that, the fact that you're interacting with other people in those multiplayer games, and there's no research on this yet, so we really need to look at it, but there might be something about that. We know that social play is very different from isolated play. And when we look at people who are experiencing gambling problems, they're much, much more likely to engage in solitary style gambling. So the very fact you're interacting with other people, engaging with them, the outcome of someone else impacts your outcome. I think there's a lot there that could be protective. However, at this stage, it's really conjuncture at this point. We need to study it in more detail.
And Sally, to that, I'll add that ultimately these games are going to be making their way onto the casino floor if they're more profitable than the games that they replace. So when we think about a unit of measurement such as win per unit per day, even if there are some sort of breaks in play, in order for them to actually be widely dispersed on the casino floor, it would have to mean that despite those breaks in play, or despite the fact that there's long sequences of time that people aren't actually betting, that the amount that they're betting during the times when they are betting is actually great enough to support the play. Hopefully, if that's the case, people are actually behaving in a more rational way, and it's because they're drawing more people in who are just playing for entertainment purposes. And that would be, I guess, the ideal situation of the protective factor of these games. But that's just one thing to think about, is it's not just about the design of the game and that one part of the structural component, but it's ultimately how it all feeds into the final business model. And if you do see these games everywhere, that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, I'll jump on that before I know I'm wishing else. Because I will mention that as well, that Matt obviously is good coming from you, and I'm sure you'll pick that point up later on. But that economic model is really interesting. So these machines were initially pulled out after they first went into Atlantic City. They pulled them off the floor because they're not as profitable, because they're often more expensive, because the gameplay takes longer, the bet has to be larger. So there's this kind of disconnect between how much people are spending. So there certainly needs to be a bit of modelling. And in where I live, New South Wales, the machines that are on the floor here, which are more like hybrid games, there's not a lot of skill involved in them. They're performing average, like very much middle, certainly not high in terms of gaming machines on the floor. However, I would say in addition to the revenue, that in the long term, they have to be profitable. But one thing is that customers are actually willing to spend more money because they actually get more time on device per bet. So it may cost more, but they get a bigger bang for their buck. And the other factor is they're willing to spend more money because they're better, they're more fun, they're more engaging, they're more entertaining. So they're actually willing to spend more money. But then the other and I'm not an economics or a casino floor design expert, but I think of it a little bit like McDonald's offering salads. That's not their core component. It's not what most people are looking for, but it gets in a new cohort of people who might turn around and start ordering French fries actually, or drinking at the bar. So it's similar to, in Australia, milk costs like $1 a litre, which is really cheap for milk these days. But the grocery stores do it as a loss leader because they put it at the back of the store. They know that people come in to get their cheap milk, and while they're there, they'll pick up all the other stuff. So I do think that there's something about the novelty effect and the fact that they're different and appeal to a new cohort that might tweak the traditional economic models of standard slot machines. But I'll stop talking.
Yeah, and certainly that's something that we might see these play a specific role in a specific type of gaming operation. So it might be, we might only see them, say, in integrated resorts where most of the revenue doesn't actually come from gaming, or we might only see them in hospitality environments where it's just people who are at the bar and they're looking for something to replace a video game, more like a more traditional type video game with this type of machine. So lots of things yet to come. Chanel, getting back to the question that I asked you about 10 minutes ago, is there anything that you see either in your own research or in your reading of the literature, as I know you've done quite a bit of lately, that would suggest to you that there's any sort of protective factors coming out of these mobile game players, Candy Crush type players?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because like you, I've also heard anecdotally that some problem gamblers end up just taking on Candy Crush as a way to offset their previous gambling behaviors. This is actually my landlord. So in thinking about that, though, I think they can be protective if the players are not engaging with microtransactions in those particular games. So although we formally haven't looked at it, given what we know from SWOT research and given their Nearmiss and urge-inducing properties, it seems likely that they might cause players to spend more time and money if microtransactions are kind of thrown into the mix. So we're actually hoping to investigate that, whether these Nearmisses actually influence the decision to purchase these power-ups, like more moves to get back into the game if they ran out of lives and got locked out, things like that. So it really depends on how they're engaging with these particular games.
I'm going to hand the conversation back to Kahlil and Chanel. Before we finish this pre-record, just want to say a huge thanks to Chanel and Kahlil for doing this out of session, and for everyone listening. Kahlil and our research is available and online. We'll put the links in the show notes. We're really happy to follow up on any of these questions. I think that there really is an argument to start replicating a lot of the work that we've done on slot machines. Essentially, you could take any study that we've done looking at gambling using slot machines and do it again using these machines. So I will certainly call for lots of replication, lots of access that we don't currently have. So, and the ability for people to really think, because I think as our studies evolve, we've gotten more sophisticated in how to run them, how to do a lot more. Certainly, I know there's lots of people we've featured already on this webinar series doing things like eyes tracking and really sophisticated methodologies. So I'm excited to see what comes next, how our gaming research we've featured heavily starts to focus on this convergence. Our webinar series are focused quite a lot on how the impact of gambling within games, and now we really need to focus the other way as well. So huge thanks to you guys. Chanel, you want to quickly comment on that?
Yeah. Okay, actually, you kind of reminded me of something, because kind of relating to the first question that you asked me and how we kind of ended up on replication. So I believe you were asking about whether the near misses were different between slot machines and Candy Crush near misses. And one thing that we are actually finding is with near misses, they seem to be arousal responses because they're so quick. The onset between when players press the spin button and get their near miss, that's when the reaction happens. But with Candy Crush near misses, players are playing for a really long time before they actually encounter that outcome. So as they're spiking and playing and getting close to leveling up, with a near miss, they might be very similar to wins as they're playing and realize that they only have 3 more and 5 moves remaining. So there is a lot of anticipatory buildup that might make that urge to continue playing a little bit more invigorating in a different way compared to slots. So it took me a while to just think about that a little bit. So.
And that research is so relevant because there's certainly a genre of these games that look exactly like Candy Crush. They're called match games. So they're essentially like a Tetris Candy Crush. All right, we will finish the conversation. I'll hand back to Chanel and Kahlil to continue and engage and for the audience questions. And thank you so much, everyone. We will see you next time.
Yes, thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about my research and to talk about this emerging topic.
Okay, well, we are back. And I first have to apologize to Chanel because it's the most painful thing in the world to watch yourself on video. And you've patiently sat there and watched this 30-minute clip. So thank you for doing that. A few things came up for me just thinking about this conversation some more, but what I'd like to do is just actually clarify one thing that you had talked about, Chanel, in your conversation there in your presentation. And that's the near miss. And so obviously most of your work focuses on structural characteristics of machines. And for me, I think I understand the near miss when it comes to a simple real slot machine. I think that's very intuitive of, you know, the cherry, almost cherry, 3 real near miss. When we talk about mobile games, and, you know, I'm thinking about this also in the structure of skill-based gambling machines, you talked a little bit about anticipatory buildup, and is that related to the near miss, or how does that all fit together? Is it a completely different phenomenon altogether, or, you know, what's the nature of a near miss, and is it as relevant to a mobile game like a Candy Crush, or even, you know, a different, more, you know, first-person shooter type skill-based gambling machine? What are your thoughts around what that might look like? I know this isn't necessarily something you've studied explicitly necessarily in the application to these casino games, but for people who are looking at that type of machine, where does this same mechanism show up, if at all?
Yeah, I think how it all ties together is in terms of the relationship between arousal and urge, which is something that we just keep finding, like they always hang together. So in a way, in slots, like they do, like players will experience higher arousal following a near miss because, in slots, because they are so frustrating. In Candy Crush, it's a little bit different because of that. There is that anticipatory arousal, like most of the action in arousal is before the outcome. So they're playing and they get closer to that win, and it's like they think they're actually going to win, but then it's like within the last few moves that they have, they just miss it. So it's almost like a double whammy in a way, where they already are amped up, and then they're just like doubling amped up to the frustration, and so that's how they're characteristically different. And something that is important to kind of keep in mind when looking at near misses in other types of games, like first-person shooters as well, is like how would the near miss be characterized? They are a little bit harder to investigate in this type of games. So we actually tried to look at near misses in Overwatch as well, which then unfortunately was a little bit muddy because we had thought that there would be, like, the near miss in that game is more of a global type of near miss as opposed to a localized event-based.
Could you just explain Overwatch for those of us
who
don't know game design?
Sorry. So Overwatch is this really popular multiplayer first-person shooter game that also contains loot boxes. That's just on the side. Yeah. So the idea is that you the basic mechanism behind it is that you pick a character and then you enter a game, and the game matches you with characters that are similar in your rank, and you can play against AI, you can play against other players, and yeah, that's just a very broad summary of the game. Yeah, so there is this type of, I hope I'm not getting too off track of this. Okay, yeah, so so what I was kind of mentioning earlier with the global versus local near miss is that there are near misses where you might just like miss, let's say, something that would help you win the mission in that moment. And then there's this other type of potential near miss where, especially in the arcade mode, where if you get 3 consecutive wins, win 3 consecutive missions, you get a loot box for free, basically. And so we tried to look at that, whether if they won 2 out of 3 games, if that's anything. And fortunately, we didn't really find anything because there's just so much going into the game that it doesn't, that it's really hard to like isolate exactly where in their skin conductance of what they're reacting to.
And so is it the question there, the confusion, is it about differentiating between conditioning effects that are sort of obvious on a slot machine where it's, you know, very immediate feedback versus, and I don't know how you would describe, you know, a quest where you're trying to do 3 different tasks which have, you know, long trials. So, you know, winning 3 consecutive games. Is that where, you know, there's still some uncertainty into what that effect might look like?
Basically, yeah. So I think it's basically the take-home message is that when looking at your misses, it's really important to kind of pay attention as to how they're, how they might be presented in the game, and if they are, and if they are quite uniform between players, because sometimes it could be like an individual experience, or like it could differ from player to player.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when we think about the, you know, the regulatory implications of all of this work, because, you know, from time to time we see regulators who are asking questions about, well, how do you feel about skill-based gaming machines, and does this matter? And, you know, even if we knew how it mattered for one type of game, it's not necessarily obvious that that transitions to another. So, you know, a first-person shooter type game like Sally showed in that opening video might be as different from a slot machine as it is from, you know, a different type of skill-based gaming machine, like the Frogger game. And so just because we don't have a great sense of how the different structural characteristics across all of these games are defined. And that's why I think some of the work that you've been doing in mobile games is really helpful, because it helps to illustrate at least some dimensions of what types of product characteristics we should be looking at, and where they might become relevant in a slot machine type game, or at least not slot machine, but in a game that appears in a casino.
For sure. Like what I find with these skill-based games too, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts about this, like, do you think they're making the games more heterogeneous? Because I know before there's like this, like slot machines were pretty, like the designs were, although they differed thematically, they do kind of have some overlap in the basic function and the basic structure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the state of that industry right now is that they just don't know what works. And so what you're seeing is a lot of experimentation around both within manufacturers who are making many different types of games, and operators who are experimenting with many different types of manufacturers and different variations. And do they do things like put it in a special place on the casino floor that's exclusively for these types of games, or do they integrate it throughout the casino floor elsewhere? One of the things that Sally mentioned on the recording was that some of these games appeared in New Jersey and then got taken off the casino floor because of poor performance. And, you know, perhaps that's not unexpected. A lot of different games, even, you know, just traditional table games, get trialed and then taken off the floor. But what we don't necessarily understand is what's going to be the popular game that actually sticks, you know, if any. And that's the type of game that we really want to write our regulations around is, okay, what's going to be relevant, you know, 5 to 10 years down the road. And I don't think that we have a good sense of what consumers will actually be gravitating towards. But thinking about the work that you've done in mobile games, you know, that's probably a good hint of the types of things that would be most likely to resonate with players. On that note, I'd like to ask you a quick question. And this is perhaps not exactly related to the types of research that you do, but it is about mobile games. And, you know, I think we could probably devote a whole session about mobile games on their own. But the question is, what do we actually know about the nature of harms happening to mobile game players? It's all these games, they start out, I guess, as freemium models where they're free to play at start. And you can run through your credits and then buy more credits. And I've only heard anecdotal evidence about, you know, some players spending large amounts of money. And, you know, there's many, I think, active lawsuits right now saying that these are actually gambling type games. And I'm, you know, not necessarily interested in that part of the conversation right now, but in your experiences, do we know anything about the nature of these players and any harms that they're experiencing?
Yeah, so that is an empirical question, because most of the the studies that I've run in lab involve students. And one thing that we're noticing is that students don't tend to be the ones who are purchasing. It seems to be like the average player of Candy Crush, for example, is a middle-aged woman, right? So soccer moms, if you want to think about it that way. So in terms of the harms, what we're sure of is that it can be, it does revolve around, well, not quite sure of, because the research isn't really there fully, and it might differ from game to game, but we can potentially expect that most of the harms are related to excessive time playing these games and getting lost in these games when you're just trying to pass the time, or like, because when you think about Candy Crush as well, like it's easy to really, or any game is, they do take up the entire screen, and it's hard to keep track of your time that way. Yeah, so another aspect too is that I think there isn't a lot of research looking at the different harms depending on the platform used, because we know that isolated gaming seems to be, or games on a desktop, for example, might be a little bit like the problematic nature seems to be more established, like with players who play like MMORPGs or just desktop games in general. Whereas when you think about mobile games, even though they're more accessible, most of our players tend to report that they just play when they're bored or waiting on the bus during travel. So there are a lot of external interruptions that can easily bring them out of it. So that is something that we should maybe focus on, is what the harms look like from game to game and also between platforms.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And, you know, one of the things that Sally and I found in our first study is actually there's a lot of crossover between these types of players, the types of people that are mobile game players, even though it's a very large population of people that are mobile game players. But at least in our sample, what we found was that was a strong predictor of whether somebody would play skill-based gaming machines in gaming environments or be willing to do so. So certainly there's, I think, a lot of places where this research can cross over. We are getting close to the end of the session. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to thank you, Chanel, for appearing both on video and then also live with us this week. We really appreciate you coming in. And what I'm going to do is give one more plug for the student seminar, which is coming up. The deadline is coming up at the end of the week. So if you have not submitted your talk to our student seminar yet, I think we maybe have 1 or 2 spots left. So the link is in the show notes. So please get in your submission if you would like to play a part in our graduate student lightning seminar series. Next week, we have another seminar, which is part of our law and gambling series. And we touched on a number of law-related elements today. And I think some of them, what we talked about this week, is actually going to be relevant to next week. We have Alex Blazinski from the University of Sydney, who's going to be joining us. I think most people who are part of this community know all about Alex. And we also have a guest speaker, Sasha Callahan from the University of Sydney. Actually, she'll be moderating the session. And then the last speaker is Becky Harris from the UNLV. She's a distinguished fellow in gaming and leadership at the International Gaming Institute. And she is actually the first female chair of the Nevada Gaming Control Board, and it's now since moved on and is in an academic role. So they will be talking about the nature of duty of care in gambling. This is something that's come up several times during our conversations, and I think it's something that we might have to touch on in a few more sessions, but we have 2 very interesting speakers, as well as a great guest moderator to speak about that topic. So with that in mind, I've gone through all of the housekeeping items. So I'm just going to thank Chanel one more time, and I'm going to thank the Brain and Mind Center for hosting this seminar, as well as thank Herschenstein for all of his work behind the scenes, making sure that we're always operating every week as smoothly as possible. But that's it for this week, and we'll see you all next week.